In Salisbury, Maryland, where everyone knows each other, it's rare for scandals to break. When Aaron Cole, a 26-year-old artist, was found dead under suspicious circumstances, it shocked the community. But the real shock came when Dr. Meredith Larson, the town's beloved physician, was implicated in the investigation. Larson had always been known as a trustworthy, caring doctor who had treated generations of Salisbury residents. Meredith Larson was a fixture in the town for over 40 years. She was seen as maternal and patient. But she was leading a secret life. She had inappropriate relationships with 3 of her male patients. They were all younger than her. There was Matthew Granger. He was a 31-year-old personal trainer. Meredith helped him recover from a sports injury. Then there was Daniel Ward. He was a 28-year-old man who struggled with anxiety and depression. Aaron Cole, the youngest and most volatile of her patients, was obsessed with Meredith. His obsession led to his death. Investigators uncovered a web of jealousy, obsession, and emotional manipulation. Dr. Larson had crossed the line with these men. One of them was dead. But who was responsible? Doctor, was it one of her other patients, or had Aaron's demons finally caught up with him? At 65, Meredith Larson craved more than just helping patients. She was alone, her marriage long over, and her large house felt empty. The respect she commanded in Salisbury was comforting, but it didn't fill the emotional void at night. Her days were Meredith spent her days at the clinic, treating patients and listening to their concerns. As the years passed, she realized she needed more than just professional fulfillment. Matthew Granger was the first man to step into that void. He was 31, younger, attractive, and full of life. He was a personal trainer who had injured his shoulder in a gym accident and came to Meredith for treatment. He was charming, confident, and flirtatious. Meredith hadn't experienced this in years. At first she brushed it off, but as their conversations became more personal, she found herself drawn to him. Matthew was the type of man who knew how to get what he wanted. Their affair began slowly. Matthew flattered Meredith, telling her how young she looked for her age. He admired her intelligence and experience. Meredith was flattered and allowed herself to be seduced. Their meetings became more frequent. Matthew wanted more and more of Meredith's time. She was happy to give it to him. Around the same time, Meredith began treating Daniel Ward. Daniel was 28 and had been struggling with severe anxiety and depression. He was the opposite of Matthew, quiet, introspective, and vulnerable. Meredith found herself drawn to Daniel's emotional fragility. Matthew was confident. Daniel was dependent and needy. Meredith spent extra time with him, offering emotional support. He became attached to her and began to confide in her. Then there was Aaron Cole, the youngest and most volatile of the 3. Aaron was an artist. Aaron was intense, moody, and passionate. He came to Meredith for help managing his mental health. Aaron was unpredictable. He would show up at her office unannounced, sometimes in the middle of the night. Meredith tried to keep things professional with Aaron, but it wasn't long before their relationship crossed the line. Meredith's relationship with Matthew crossed the line. She had always kept her personal life separate from her work, but that changed when she began her affair with him. It was exciting at first. Matthew was confident and good-looking. He made her feel special and young. But there was a price. Matthew wanted more. He became possessive and demanded more of Meredith's time and attention. He showed up at her clinic unannounced, called her late at night, and insisted that she spend more time with him. Meredith was flattered at first but began to feel trapped. Matthew's demands were overwhelming. She found it difficult to juggle her professional responsibilities with the emotional demands of their relationship. Daniel's relationship with Meredith was becoming more complicated. Daniel was emotionally fragile, and as their relationship deepened, he became more dependent on Meredith. Meredith would take his calls at all hours, offering him comfort and reassurance. As Daniel's dependency grew, Meredith felt guilty. She knew she was crossing a line, but she couldn't bring herself to cut him off. Meanwhile, Aaron Cole was becoming a more frequent presence in her life. He was different from the other two men. His emotions were volatile and his moods unpredictable. He would show up at her office unannounced, demanding to see her and insisting that she spend time with him. Erin's obsession with Meredith was growing. She knew she should distance herself from him, but she found herself unable to resist his intensity. Meredith's life had become a balancing act. She tried to keep her relationships with Matthew, Daniel, and Aaron separate, but it was becoming difficult. Each man wanted more from her, and she was running out of ways to keep them apart. The strain of managing these relationships was taking a toll on her, and she was becoming more distracted at work. Meredith continued her relationships with all three men, telling herself that she had everything under control. But she knew her life was spiraling out of control. Meredith's relationships with Matthew, Daniel, and Aaron deepened, making her double life more complex. Each man was possessive, and the strain of keeping them apart was starting to show. Meredith had become good at compartmentalizing her life, but it was only a matter of time before the walls between boxes began to crumble. Matthew, the confident and controlling presence, sensed that something was wrong. Matthew was the dominant force in their relationship. Lately, Meredith had been distant. She was no longer as attentive as she once was. Matthew was jealous. He started showing up at her clinic unannounced. He questioned her about her whereabouts. He demanded to know who else she was spending time with. Meredith tried to reassure him. Her attempts only seemed to fuel his suspicions. Matthew was jealous and started following Meredith, trying to catch her at home. Meredith was scared of what Matthew would find out. Daniel was becoming more dependent on Meredith. He was having more anxiety attacks and calling her more often. Daniel needed Meredith, and she needed him. But his dependency was dangerous. He showed up at her house unannounced, sometimes in the middle of the night. Meredith was flattered but knew his emotional fragility was a liability. Aaron was the most predictable of the three. His obsession with Meredith was growing. He started following her outside of work. He would leave notes on her car and wait outside her clinic. Meredith tried to distance herself from Aaron, but his intensity was hard to resist. There was something about his passion that drew her in. One night, after a particularly intense argument with Aaron, Meredith found herself feeling more trapped than ever. Aaron threatened to expose their relationship. Meredith was terrified of losing everything. Aaron was relentless. He wanted her all to himself. Meredith Larson's life had always been organized and predictable. She never imagined that her world could spiral into chaos because of her emotional dependencies on her patients. Now, Aaron's obsession with Meredith was threatening to destroy everything. He had always been volatile, and Meredith knew this from the moment he became her patient. His artwork reflected the turbulent mind of a man on the edge. What began as a professional relationship quickly morphed into something more. Meredith had a weakness for feeling needed for being someone's savior. Aaron wasn't like the others. He wanted her to reciprocate his passion. The more Meredith tried to pull away from him, the more intense his obsession became. He began following her outside of work, showing up at her house late at night and sending her messages that veered between declarations of love and accusations of betrayal. One particularly cold winter night, Aaron arrived at Meredith's doorstep, pounding on it. He knocked on the door so hard that she thought it might break. His face was pale and gaunt from lack of sleep. He was desperate. "You promised you wouldn't abandon me," he yelled. "You said you understood me. Meredith, why are you pulling away? Is it because of them? Matthew, Daniel, you think I don't know?" Meredith's heart raced as she opened the door, but she kept her composure. "Aaron, you need to calm down," she said softly, though her own nerves were frayed. "This can't go on like this. You need help. I can't be the only person you rely on." His expression shifted from desperation to rage. "You're just like everyone else. You're going to throw me away when I'm no longer useful to you." Aaron stepped closer. She had never been afraid of him before, but tonight there was something different in his eyes. His eyes were dangerous. "I'm not going anywhere. Aaron, I don't want to fight. We can talk later." Aaron's face darkened. "I don't want to go home. I need you to understand I can't live without you." The argument got worse. Meredith was afraid this day would come. One of her patients would be consumed by. Meredith was consumed by fear. Aaron's behavior became erratic. He was capable of something far worse than gossip. After what felt like hours, he finally stormed off, leaving Meredith trembling in her doorway. She knew this wasn't over. He sent her messages at all hours, apologizing and threatening to expose their relationship. Meredith's anxiety grew. She couldn't risk losing everything she had worked so hard to build. Meanwhile, Matthew and Daniel were becoming suspicious of Meredith's behavior. Matthew, always possessive and jealous, questioned her about where she was spending her time. He sensed that she was starting to feel insecure. He went to Meredith's clinic, watching her with suspicion. Daniel was becoming emotionally fragile. He felt like Meredith was distancing herself from him, and it made him depressed. He called her a lot and had more anxiety attacks. He relied on her for everything and was scared of losing her. But he wasn't angry. Like Matthew or Aaron, he was desperate. The tension reached its breaking point on the night of Aaron's death. Meredith had received another barrage of frantic messages from Aaron earlier in the evening, but she ignored them. Aaron wasn't the type to be ignored. He had decided that this was the night everything would come to a head. When Aaron arrived at Meredith's house, he was more volatile than ever. He accused her of leading him on and using him. He threatened to go public with their affair. "I'll ruin you," he hissed. "You can't pretend like none of this happened. You owe me." Meredith was terrified and tried to reason with him, but Aaron was beyond reason. Aaron stormed out of Meredith's house and was found dead hours later. The pills found in his system were prescribed by Meredith, but the dosage was far higher than anything she had ever recommended. There were other signs suggesting foul play. The police weren't ready to call it a suicide or rule out homicide. The investigation into Aaron Cole's death had only just begun. Detectives Sarah Cohen and Mark Jacobs had seen it all. The case of Aaron Cole's death felt different from the moment they walked into his apartment. The apartment was small and cluttered. At first glance, it seemed like a straightforward overdose. Aaron had a history of mental health issues, and the pills scattered around his body suggested a tragic but intentional end to a troubled life. But as Sarah and Mark examined the room more closely, small details stood out. The way Aaron's body was positioned on the floor, the faint bruise on his wrist, and the fact that the pill bottle was almost too neatly placed beside him all suggested something else was going on. Someone might have been with him in his final moments. Sarah began by reviewing Aaron's phone records. The late-night messages to Dr. Meredith Larson caught her attention. There were dozens of them. Some were rambling and desperate. Others were angry and accusatory. The messages showed Aaron spiraling out of control. They also hinted at something more. There was a deeper, more complicated relationship between Aaron and his doctor. The detectives visited Dr. Larson's office. The next morning, Meredith greeted them with a calm, composed demeanor. She didn't seem surprised by their visit and answered their questions with ease. She had treated Aaron for emotional issues and prescribed him medication, but hadn't seen him in days. She didn't know he was in such a state. As Sarah pressed her, she hesitated. Meredith hesitated. Aaron was a complicated patient. She said he relied on her for more than just medical advice. She became a confidant for him. Sarah repeated, "That seems like a lot of responsibility for a doctor to take on." Meredith shifted uncomfortably. Aaron didn't have many people he could talk to. He needed someone to listen. The interview ended without any definitive answers. But Sarah and Mark left the clinic with a feeling that there was more to the story than Meredith was saying. The next step was to interview Matthew Granger and Daniel Ward, who had also been under Meredith's care. Matthew was the first to come in and seemed hostile when asked about Aaron. "I barely knew the guy," he said. "What's this about?" "He had nothing to do with me," but as the detectives pressed him about his relationship with Meredith, he admitted he was involved with her, but it was over. "She didn't have time for me anymore," Matthews said bitterly. "She was too busy with all her other patients, including Aaron. But I didn't care. I moved on." His words were dismissive, but the detectives could hear the underlying resentment. Could Matthews' jealousy have driven him to confront Aaron? Daniel was more emotional. He arrived at the station looking disheveled, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He seemed nervous and fidgeting in his chair as the detectives questioned him about his relationship with Meredith and Aaron. Daniel said he didn't know Aaron well, but Meredith mentioned him a few times and he could tell she was worried. Daniel was nervous when he was asked about the night of Aaron's death. He said he wasn't there, but his eyes moved away from the detectives. His body language showed he was hiding something. Sarah and Mark kept investigating and found more problems. Meredith had given Aaron drugs, but the dosage was much higher than she would have given. There were also traces of another person's DNA on the bottle. Another person's DNA was on the pill bottle. This pointed to someone else being in Aaron's apartment that night. The case was not clear-cut, but one thing was evident: Aaron Cole's death was not a simple overdose. Meredith's relationships with her patients were more entangled than anyone realized. One of those relationships led to Aaron's death. The investigation into Aaron's death had reached a critical point. Point detectives Sarah Cohen and Mark Jacobs had gathered enough evidence to know that Aaron's overdose was not as straightforward as it seemed. They needed to find out who had administered the fatal dose and why. The first major breakthrough came when the forensic team matched the DNA on the pill bottle to Daniel Ward. Daniel, the quiet patient, had been at Aaron's apartment the night of his death. But why? What was his connection to Aaron? Daniel was brought in for questioning again. This time, the detectives wanted answers. Daniel confessed to being in Aaron's apartment the night he died. He said he had become jealous of Aaron's relationship with Meredith. Daniel knew Meredith and Aaron were seeing each other outside of therapy. Daniel followed him to his apartment to confront him about it. When he got there, Aaron was in the middle of a breakdown. He was ranting about Meredith, accusing her of abandoning him. Daniel was overwhelmed by the situation and tried to calm Aaron down, but he was out of control. He kept saying he wanted to end it all. Daniel gave him the pills, but he kept taking more. The detectives listened in. Daniel said Aaron took the pills at first willingly, then more erratically. Daniel hadn't tried to stop him. He thought Aaron's death was inevitable. He convinced himself he wasn't responsible. Sarah and Mark weren't convinced Daniel was passive. There were traces of his DNA on the pill. The bottle showed he had more control over the situation than he was admitting. Daniel's confession showed he was a troubled man caught in a tragic situation. But it didn't explain everything. How had the pills ended up in Aaron's system in such a lethal dosage? Had Daniel given them to him, or had he just watched as Aaron took them? Meredith was still under suspicion. The detectives knew she had been involved with all three men. Could she have manipulated Daniel into confronting Aaron? Was she using her patient's vulnerabilities to cover her tracks? As the investigation continued, more evidence came to light. Witnesses said they had seen Daniel and Aaron arguing in the weeks before Aaron's death. One neighbor reported hearing shouting from Aaron's apartment on the night he died, but they couldn't make out what was said. Another witness saw Meredith, and Daniel was seen with Meredith outside the clinic several times. Messages from Aaron's phone showed a darker side to their relationship. In one message, Aaron accused Meredith of playing with his life and threatened to expose everything. Meredith's response was, "You're not thinking clearly. You need to calm down." The detectives had enough evidence to charge Daniel and Meredith for Aaron's death. The web of relationships had unraveled. Aaron's death was not a simple overdose. It was the result of months of emotional manipulation, jealousy, and obsession. The trial of Meredith and Daniel became the talk of the town. The town of Alsbury, once trusting of their doctor, looked on in disbelief as details of Meredith's secret life were revealed in court. The media turned the case into a national story of love, betrayal, and tragedy. The prosecution presented a case against Meredith, arguing that she had violated patient trust by engaging in inappropriate relationships and manipulating emotions for her own gain. They said she had used her power to control men, which led to Aaron's death. They showed text messages between Meredith and Aaron, which showed she knew about his mental problems and did nothing to stop him. Daniel's defense was that he was mentally unstable. His attorneys said Meredith had taken advantage of his dependency on her. Daniel said he didn't mean to hurt Aaron. He said he was caught up in a bad situation. Daniel said he was sad and scared when Aaron died. Meredith's lawyers said she made mistakes but wasn't responsible for Aaron's death. They said she was a kind doctor who made mistakes. Meredith said she had become too involved in her patients' lives. She said she had not intended for anyone to be harmed. She said Daniel had acted alone in giving Aaron pills. She said she had had no part in the events that led to his death. The jury was not convinced. After weeks of testimony, they found Daniel guilty of involuntary manslaughter. They sentenced him to 15 years in prison. They said he was mentally fragile and had been emotionally manipulated by Meredith. The jury found that Meredith's actions had directly led to Aaron's death. She was acquitted of murder but found guilty of professional misconduct and gross negligence. The jury said that her inappropriate relationships with her patients had created the conditions that allowed Aaron's death to occur. She lost her medical license and was sentenced to 2 years of probation. She lost everything she had built over her long career. The courtroom emptied and the media frenzy died down. Meredith was left to face the consequences of her actions. Her reputation in Salisbury was destroyed. Her clinic closed. The town that had once respected and trusted her now saw her as a woman who had let her personal desires cloud her judgment, leading to a young man's tragic death. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment with a 0 and check out more intriguing cases on our channel.